3.5 years into marriage. It sounded so much simpler when I said it out loud. Just a number, a marker of time. But when I sat still and let myself feel it, really feel it, it unraveled like a thread I couldn't stop pulling. 3.5 years of Sunday mornings curled into each other, of whispered promises and wild road trips, and dancing in the kitchen while the pasta boiled over. But lately, it felt like all of that had belonged to someone else. Someone braver. Someone more alive. Certainly not the woman who now stood in front of her espresso machine, staring at the blinking green light like it held all the answers. Calder's tie was still slung over the arm of the couch, the navy one with the faint silver threads I bought him on our second anniversary. He used to care about things like that. He used to notice the way I folded his pocket squares, or how I'd sneak handwritten notes into his briefcase before big presentations. But these days, he didn't even notice when I went to bed early or skipped our Friday night rituals. These days, we were two people who shared a mortgage and a Google Calendar. I turned the machine off before the coffee finished brewing. Greyford was alive outside our windows, full of honking cars, chatter spilling from sidewalk cafes, the clack of designer heels against pavement. I used to love the buzz of it all, the constant sense of movement. But now it just felt like noise, the kind that pressed into your temples and sat heavy behind your eyes. I couldn't tell if the city had changed or if I had. Calder had left early again, something about a quarterly regional meeting in Midtown and a chance to grab lunch with his boss. I didn't ask questions anymore. It wasn't worth the effort of pretending I didn't already know the answer would be half-hearted, vague, and just polished enough to make me feel foolish for asking. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop, the screen flickering to life with my endless spreadsheet of deliverables, timelines, and client requests. Project management kept me grounded. Predictable. Linear. I could track progress, identify bottlenecks, manage risks. Everything made sense inside those rows and columns. Everything had a place. Unlike my marriage, which had slowly unraveled in ways I hadn't known how to chart. I used to be able to read Calder's moods just by the way he set his keys down or the rhythm of his breath as he drifted off to sleep. Now, he moved through the apartment like a ghost, present but hollow, his touches more habitual than heartfelt. He still kissed me goodbye in the mornings, still asked if I needed anything when he stopped for groceries, still texted me the occasional, "Miss you today," but all of it felt like muscle memory. I missed being seen. Not just looked at, but truly seen, the way he used to watch me when I spoke too passionately about some new project, or when I danced barefoot on our balcony during thunderstorms. I missed that Marin. The one who laughed loud, cried easily, and believed in second chances. I wasn't sure where she'd gone. I clicked through emails, trying to focus, but my mind drifted. My wedding dress was still tucked in the back of the closet, wrapped in plastic, untouched since the day I had it cleaned. I thought about pulling it out sometimes, just to look at it, to remember the woman who had walked down the aisle with stars in her eyes and Calder's promises in her chest. But I couldn't. Not because it would hurt too much, but because I didn't think I'd recognize her. The first time Calder said, "I love you," we were standing in the rain outside a taco truck. My hair was soaked, my heels were ruined, and he'd just lost a huge client deal. But he looked at me like I was the only steady thing in his world, and he said it like it was a fact, not a question. And I had believed him. Every part of me had. Now, I couldn't remember the last time those words had passed between us without a pause or a sigh trailing after them. I shut the laptop and leaned back, staring up at the ceiling. There was a water stain forming in the corner from the last big storm. We kept saying we'd call someone to fix it. Just like we kept saying we'd book a weekend away, start that home garden on the balcony, maybe even adopt a dog like we used to talk about in the early days. But all those promises had dissolved into someday, and someday had quietly become never. Dinner had become a series of polite negotiations, who was home, who was working late, who felt like takeout. Sex had become a memory. And silence. Silence had become our native language. Comfortable in its familiarity, but painful in its truth. I stood and walked to the window. Across the street, an older couple sat on a park bench, their shoulders touching, hands clasped between them like an old secret. I wondered if they still told each other everything. If they fought, but always came back to the same place. If they'd ever gone silent like we had, and if they'd found their way back. I didn't want to give up. That was the worst part. I didn't want to be the woman who walked away just because things got hard. But I also didn't want to be the woman who stayed because it was easier than facing the unknown. I wanted to fight, but I wasn't sure Calder was even in the ring with me anymore. My phone buzzed. A text from Calder. Hope your day's going okay. Might be home late. That was it. No heart, no question mark, not even a call later. I stared at it for a moment before setting it down. From harmony to silence. That was the journey we had taken. And now, sitting in the apartment we had once called a love nest, I couldn't help but wonder, had we simply drifted too far to find each other again? It was one of those ordinary evenings that tried too hard to pretend nothing had changed. The kind where we moved around each other in the kitchen with forced politeness, like two strangers sharing an Airbnb. Calder had swung by the store after work, like he said he would, though I had expected the text saying he was stuck late in the office, like usual. Instead, he arrived at the apartment door, balancing 2 bags of groceries, flashing me that same familiar smile that once meant everything. Now it just felt empty. Can you grab the other bag from the car? He asked as he kicked off his shoes and headed straight for the kitchen. Sure, I said, brushing my hair behind my ears as I slipped on sandals and grabbed the spare keys from the hook. My voice sounded too calm to my own ears, too even. I was learning to play this part well. The garage downstairs was dim, the overhead lights buzzing in that flickery, unreliable way. Calder's black sedan was parked in his usual spot, spotless as ever. He was meticulous about it, always getting it detailed, vacuumed, the leather wiped down with those expensive oils he claimed kept it from cracking. I opened the passenger door to reach for the second grocery bag on the floor, already half suspecting I'd find something forgotten, an empty water bottle, a receipt from some overpriced cafe, maybe one of his Bluetooth earbuds. What I wasn't expecting was the flash of lavender tucked just beneath the seat. I froze. It was delicate, silky, with tiny embroidered edges. My breath caught before my brain had a chance to argue with what I already knew. I bent down slowly, reaching beneath the seat with trembling fingers and pulling it out with the hesitation of someone defusing a bomb. A bra. A silk lavender bra. Not mine. Not remotely mine. I stared at it, disoriented by how absurdly small it looked in my hands, like something from a dream I wanted to wake up from. It was the color of lilacs, of spring mornings, of soft femininity. And there, hanging from the clasp, was a boutique tag I recognized, not because I'd ever bought anything from there, but because I'd passed it countless times on the corner of Main and Thatcher, their windows full of lace and perfume and expensive things meant to impress. Calder had never bought me anything from there. Not even once. I could already hear the excuses forming in my head. Maybe it belonged to someone else. Maybe he'd picked someone up for work. Maybe, but none of them could drown out the truth screaming in my chest. The silence pressed in around me, sharp and accusatory. I didn't realize how long I'd been standing there until my fingers tightened around the fabric and I forced myself to breathe. In. Out. I placed it back where I'd found it, tucking it under the seat again, like returning an unwelcome spirit to the grave. I grabbed the bag of groceries, my arms feeling suddenly weightless and numb, and walked back to the apartment like a woman walking on glass. Inside, Calder was humming. Some upbeat song from the radio, some nothing tune he probably didn't even know the lyrics to. He looked up as I walked in and smiled. Thanks, babe. You're the best. I nodded, forcing a smile so tight it felt like my skin might crack. I watched him as he pulled out pasta, sauce, a bottle of wine. He was making an effort, or trying to appear as if he was. Or maybe he was just keeping up the illusion for the sake of convenience. He leaned against the counter, scrolling through his phone like everything was fine, like our life hadn't just shifted beneath my feet. And still, I said nothing. Not because I was unsure. I wasn't. My stomach told me what my mouth refused to say. My gut, the one I had learned to silence over the past year, was roaring with clarity now. But I stayed quiet, the silence heavy in my throat like gravel. Because I needed more. Needed to be sure, not just emotionally certain, but undeniably so. The kind of sure that couldn't be spun or gaslight or dismissed with tired charm and a kiss on the forehead. "Want a glass of wine?" he asked. "No, I'm good," I said. He raised a brow. "You sure? It's that red you like." "I'm fine." He shrugged and turned back to the cutting board, whistling now, and I stood there watching him from across the island, the man I once trusted with every cell in my body. I stared at his back, the slope of his shoulders, the familiarity of his movements. And I wondered how long he had been lying. Not just in action, but in spirit. How long had he looked at me like I was the only one, while giving pieces of himself to someone else? Later, I sat on the couch, pretending to scroll my phone, while he flipped through channels. We didn't talk much. I didn't ask where he'd been the night before or why he hadn't answered when I called. I didn't ask who wore lavender bras from boutique stores or why one had ended up in his pristine car. But my heart already knew. It was no longer guessing. That night, after he'd fallen asleep, I lay beside him with my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, breathing quietly so I wouldn't disturb the man who had cracked my world open without a single confession. And in the stillness of that bedroom, beneath the city's muted lights, I made myself a promise, not to be gaslight, not to second guess. I would find the truth. And I would decide what kind of life I wanted from there. But tonight, I would wait. Tonight, I would gather the pieces. Tomorrow, I would begin to arrange them. I lit the last candle on the table, stepping back to admire the soft flicker of amber light dancing across the wine glasses. The pasta was already plated, linguine with lemon garlic cream sauce, topped with grilled shrimp and a sprinkle of chopped parsley, just the way he liked it. A fresh loaf of sourdough sat on the cutting board, steam still curling from its center, and I'd poured 2 generous glasses of Cabernet. The record player in the corner spun a quiet jazz tune, something Calder once called perfect dinner music. Everything was perfect. Except it wasn't. I'd spent the whole afternoon preparing. Not because it was a special occasion. No birthday, no anniversary, no promotion. Just a Wednesday. Just me, trying one last time to remember what we used to be. I needed to feel like we could still be that couple, the one who used to eat on the floor when the furniture hadn't arrived yet, who laughed over burnt pancakes and danced to songs we couldn't name. He was already 20 minutes late. I checked the roast timer, even though there wasn't one. Just habit. My phone buzzed against the counter, and I didn't even need to look. His name lit up the screen with a predictability that made my chest ache. Calder. Just hopped out of the shower. "I have to meet the team at Brantley's." It came up last minute. "Don't wait up, okay?" I read the text twice, not because I needed to understand it better, but because I wanted to feel every sting of it. The shower. So he was already home before this? He'd chosen to come home, clean up, and leave again without telling me first. A shower meant planning. It meant intention. And this was not last minute. I swallowed the burn rising in my throat. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the pasta across the kitchen tile, to hurl the wine glasses against the wall just to hear the shatter. But I didn't. I picked up a cracker from the appetizer plate I'd arranged with olives and cheese, biting down on it like it was all I'd been waiting for. Dry, flavorless. Like everything else lately. The front door creaked open. Calder's voice carried in from the hallway. "Hey babe, sorry. I just got a message from Jared, last-minute drinks at Brantley's. Team morale thing." He leaned in and kissed the top of my head, his breath warm and minty. "You look nice, by the way." I looked down at my dress. Simple, navy, soft cotton. Not over the top. Not dramatic. Just enough to feel like myself again, to try. "I made dinner," I said quietly, motioning toward the table. His eyes shifted toward the setup, and for the briefest moment, something flickered across his face. Guilt, maybe. But it passed too quickly to mean anything. "God, it smells amazing," he said, reaching for a piece of bread and popping it into his mouth. "You're the best, seriously. Rain check this weekend?" I didn't answer. He was already slipping on his blazer. "I won't be late," he called over his shoulder, grabbing his keys from the dish. "Text me if you need anything, okay?" The door closed before I could decide whether I would. The apartment fell silent again. Only the soft hum of the record remained, the singer crooning something sultry about love and loss. I stood still in the kitchen, unsure whether I wanted to scream or crumble. I poured his glass of wine into mine, then sat down at the table and took a bite of the linguine. It tasted like salt and regret. And I ate it anyway, alone at a table meant for two. When I finished half the plate, I pushed the rest aside and got up, walking to the closet where his jacket hung. The idea had hit me earlier that week, sharp and instinctual. I needed proof. I needed more than what I'd seen under the seat. I needed to stop giving him the benefit of the doubt just because we had a shared lease and a shared bed. I slipped my fingers into the inside pocket of his blazer and felt the cold curve of a device, his work phone. He always kept it on silent, always told me it was just for company stuff, contracts and data calls, nothing exciting. I had slipped it into my purse earlier this week during one of his long showers, then quietly placed it back before he'd noticed. He hadn't even mentioned it missing. Now I switched it on and opened the tracking app I'd downloaded onto it. It lit up with a blinking blue dot. I grabbed my keys and headed to the car before I could talk myself out of it. Brantley's Bar and Lounge sat on the corner of Westview and Piper, slick, modern, the kind of place that served small plate sliders for $15 and marketed networking nightcaps. I parked across the street and waited, eyes glued to the front entrance. The tracking app told me he was there. That part, at least, wasn't a lie. But 20 minutes later, I watched him exit through the side door, not alone. A woman walked beside him, tall and graceful, her dark curls falling past her shoulders. She laughed at something he said, slipping her arm through his like it belonged there. They didn't glance around. They didn't sneak or rush or hesitate. They walked casually, confidently, as if this were just another evening together. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, my breath turning shallow. I followed them at a distance as they strolled down 2 blocks, then stopped outside the Marlin Hotel. Calder stepped forward to open the door for her. She smiled, touched his chest, and walked in. He followed. I didn't move. I sat in my car, the engine still humming beneath me, my eyes burning, throat closing like it was wrapped in wire. I didn't need to go inside. I didn't need to confront them. The lavender bra. The lies. The missed dinners and vague texts. This was the confirmation I didn't want but couldn't unsee. I drove home slowly, the city lights blurring past like smears of color. The apartment greeted me in silence, still warm from the dinner I had cooked for a man who was never coming back to me. Not really. I blew out the candles one by one, each little flame snuffing out with a faint hiss. And I stood there in the dark, a meal for one congealing on the table, and finally let myself feel what I had been too afraid to admit until now. It was over. I didn't remember getting in the car. One moment I was standing in the dim glow of our kitchen, a dirty plate in the sink, wine lingering on my tongue like a bitter aftertaste, and the next I was cruising past the city limits, my hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing tethering me to earth. Grayford disappeared behind me, its skyline shrinking in the rearview mirror, swallowed by the fog of disbelief and rage. I didn't have a destination. Just the overwhelming need to be away. Streetlights blurred into long gold streaks on my windshield. The road wound out of the city, curving like a question I didn't know how to answer. My phone buzzed in the passenger seat, lighting up every few minutes with a new message from Calder. I ignored them all. Not because I was trying to be strategic or cold. I just couldn't bring myself to read his excuses. I wasn't ready for the rewrites of the truth I'd already seen. A green highway sign flashed past. Harper Glen, 4 miles. I didn't know Harper Glen. I didn't even remember hearing about it. But the name sounded soft, like something out of a quiet novel. It felt right, or at least, not wrong. That was enough. I exited the freeway, following a narrow 2-lane road that twisted through trees and hills and a silence I hadn't felt in months. The town was small. One main road. A gas station with flickering lights. A florist closed for the night. A diner with an open sign that looked like it hadn't been turned off in a decade. I kept driving until I spotted a building on the edge of town with soft yellow lights spilling through lace curtains. A wooden sign swung lazily in the breeze, the Hollow Glass Tavern. I parked in the gravel lot and stepped into the kind of warmth that makes your eyes sting, not from heat, but from the strange safety of it. Low lights, worn booths, a jukebox humming in the corner. It was the kind of place where everyone probably knew everyone and strangers stood out. I didn't care. The bartender looked up as I slid onto a stool. Her eyes were kind, the kind that had seen things but never judged. "Long drive?" she asked. I nodded, unzipping my jacket. "Something like that." She poured a glass of whiskey without asking what I wanted. "First one's on the house," she said, placing it in front of me. "You look like you need it." I let the glass sit there for a second before lifting it to my lips. The burn was sharp, honest. I closed my eyes and swallowed it down. "Thanks," I said, meaning it more than she probably knew. "I'm Camille," she offered, leaning against the counter. "And you?" "Marin," I replied. "Just passing through." Camille didn't push for more. Just nodded and went back to wiping down the bar, giving me space while staying close enough to remind me I wasn't alone. It was a kindness I hadn't felt in a long time. The door creaked open a few minutes later, and a woman in jeans and worn boots stepped in, shaking off the cold. She nodded to Camille, then glanced at me. I must have looked out of place, sitting there in my city clothes, mascara smudged from the drive. She slid onto the stool beside me and offered a half smile. "New in town?" "Something like that," I said again, realizing how often I used those words to avoid the truth. "I'm Reina," she said, holding out a hand. "You look like someone who either ran away from a bad date or a bad life." I laughed, sharp and tired. "Not a date. Just a bad husband." She whistled low. "That'll do it." I looked at her more closely, tan skin weathered from the sun, short curls tucked behind her ears, the confidence of someone who didn't need approval to feel whole. She sipped her beer and looked at me sideways. "You got a place to stay?" I shook my head. "Didn't plan that far ahead." "Got a little trailer on my land," she said casually, like she was offering me a cup of coffee. "It's not fancy. Old, but dry. Nobody's lived in it since my cousin left for Idaho. It's quiet out there. Lots of stars." I blinked. "You're offering a stranger a place to stay?" She shrugged. "You don't look dangerous. And I'm a pretty good shot." Camille laughed from behind the bar. "Reina's the town's unofficial mayor, landlord, and truth serum. If she says you're safe, you're probably safer than you've been in a long time." I didn't know what to say. My throat felt tight again, but not from grief this time, from relief. A kindness so simple, so unexpected, it nearly undid me. I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Reina said. "Then finish that drink, and I'll drive you up. You look like you need sleep that doesn't come with city noise and lies." That got me. I nodded slowly, the words catching somewhere in my chest. "Okay," I said, almost in a whisper. "Yes." Camille packed me a bag of snacks and a bottle of water without being asked. "You'll come back for coffee tomorrow," she said, like it was a promise. And somehow I believed her. Reina's truck smelled like pine and something faintly smoky, like a wood stove. We drove in silence for a while, the road winding higher into the hills. I watched the trees blur past, the stars growing clearer the farther we went from town. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I turned it off without looking. The trailer sat tucked behind a line of tall pines, nestled in a clearing where moonlight draped itself across the grass like silk. It was old, but clean. A wooden porch. A tin roof that would probably sing when it rained. Reina handed me the keys. "There's extra blankets inside. Heat works. Water's hooked up. If you need anything, I'm down the hill at the main house." I stepped inside. The air smelled like cedar and old paperbacks. A small kitchen, a twin bed, a narrow table beside the window. Not much, but enough. More than enough. I turned on a lamp, casting a soft glow across the wood-paneled walls, and sat down on the bed, letting my shoes fall to the floor. Outside, the world was still. No sirens, no traffic, no phone ringing with false promises. Just wind in the trees. Just me. And for the first time in what felt like years, I let myself breathe. The silence out here wasn't empty. It wrapped around me like a shawl, humming with crickets at night and birdsong at dawn. No sirens, no elevator dings, no buzzing phones vibrating across glass tables. Just wind threading through the pine trees, the rustle of branches shifting like thoughts I hadn't yet put into words. It had been 3 days since I arrived in Raina's trailer, and I hadn't told a single soul where I was. Calder was still calling, I could feel it, even with my phone powered off and stuffed in a drawer. But I wasn't ready to speak. I was still learning how to listen. Raina didn't ask questions. She waved once from her porch on the first morning and left a basket on my steps by the second, homemade cornbread, a jar of blueberry jam, and a note that said, "In case you forget how to nourish yourself." It was the kind of gesture that nearly made me cry, not from sadness, but from recognition. She saw something in me. The hollow places. And instead of poking at them, she filled them gently. Most days, I spent hours just sitting at the window, watching the woods breathe. Some part of me waited for panic to set in, for the ache of isolation, the fear of what now, but it never came. I was no longer bracing for the slam of a door, the clipped tone of a lie wrapped in a compliment, or the tension of navigating another conversation where everything I said was twisted. Here, I was alone. And yet, I felt less lonely. I knew I couldn't hide forever. But before I could leave Calder, I needed a plan, not just an escape, but an exit that couldn't be unraveled or manipulated. Confrontation wasn't an option. I knew Calder too well. He'd find a way to talk circles around me, to apologize with just enough sincerity to make me doubt what I'd seen. Then he'd offer some half-truth and flash that boyish smile I once loved, and suddenly I'd be second-guessing again. No, I didn't want to fight. I wanted freedom. So I became quiet. Strategic. During the day, I drove back to the city, slipping in and out of the apartment while he was at work. I knew his schedule down to the hour. He was nothing if not predictable when it came to his routine. I packed deliberately, only what mattered. My laptop, external hard drives, my leather-bound journals, my grandmother's bracelet, a small stack of books I couldn't part with, and enough clothes to last the season. Everything else, the framed wedding photos, the curated decor we'd chosen together, the bedding with our initials stitched into the corners, I left behind. I didn't want anything touched by his deceit. I used plain brown boxes. Nothing loud. No suitcases that might draw attention if a neighbor saw. I moved things in stages, one carload at a time, like I was quietly erasing myself from our life. By the second trip, I found myself pausing in the hallway, staring at the gallery wall we'd once built together. Photos from Prague, our engagement in Zion, my 30th birthday in that little vineyard outside Sonoma. I studied our smiles, his arms around me, my eyes alight with trust, and I felt a strange pity for the woman in those pictures. She didn't know yet. She believed in promises. She believed that love was enough. I gently took down the smallest photo, just one. Us on the couch, laughing at something off camera, my hand in his. I kept that one. Not because I wanted to remember the good, but because I needed to remind myself how completely things can shift. It would be my cautionary relic. By the 5th trip, I had stripped my side of the closet bare. He wouldn't notice at first. I'd always had a minimalist style, and his clothes, rows of button-downs and color-coded ties, took up most of the space anyway. I left the lavender bra in his car. Let him explain that to himself. Each evening, I returned to the trailer, my little pocket of peace. I unpacked my boxes slowly, almost reverently, as if arranging the life I would now begin. I slid my journals into the drawer beside the bed, stacked my books near the window, folded my sweaters with care. This place wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Every item here was chosen. Nothing was tainted by pretense. Camille had become a kind of anchor too. I'd stop by the hollow glass in the late afternoons, sometimes for coffee, sometimes just for company. She never asked for details, but she listened with her whole presence whenever I felt like talking. I'd tell her little things about Calder's patterns, about the years I spent pretending we were okay, about the quiet grief of waking up next to someone who no longer saw you. She'd nod, her hands always moving, wiping the bar, pouring drinks, rearranging straws. But her eyes never left mine. Some people only love the version of you that needs saving, she said once, setting down a mug in front of me. The moment you stop needing them, they stop seeing you. That truth lived in my bones now. One night, Raina invited me down for a fire. Just the two of us and a bottle of bourbon under a velvet sky littered with stars. We sat in mismatched chairs, the fire crackling between us, silence stretched out like an old friend. She finally spoke after a long sip from her glass. "You're stronger than you look, Marin," she said. "I don't feel strong." "Strength isn't a feeling," she said. "It's a choice you make over and over. And you've been choosing yourself for days now. Don't stop." Her words hung in the night air like embers, glowing, then settling. Back in the trailer, I stared at the folded letter I'd been working on. No dramatic speeches. No detailed accusations. Just a simple truth. I wrote it in pen, slowly, clearly, leaving nothing open to interpretation. I signed it with my full name, Marin Eliza Blake, then slipped my wedding ring into the envelope beside it. I didn't feel sadness as I sealed it. I felt clean. Like I was washing off years of something I hadn't realized was poisoning me. The plan was nearly complete. He'd be gone that weekend for a corporate retreat, a fact I confirmed when I overheard him telling his assistant over speakerphone. I'd leave the note on the table while he was away. By the time he came home, I'd be gone for good. No fights. No scenes. Just a quiet exit. The kind that can't be undone. The day I left didn't begin with fireworks. It began with silence. Familiar, heavy silence. Calder had left early that morning, suitcase in one hand, coffee in the other, already speaking into his Bluetooth before the front door had closed behind him. I didn't even kiss him goodbye. He didn't notice. That small omission, once unthinkable, now passed between us like routine. Our lives had become a series of skipped gestures. No tenderness. No ceremony. Just the mechanics of partnership without the presence of love. The moment the door clicked shut, I let myself exhale. A long, slow breath that shook a little in my chest as I released it. I stood in the living room for a full minute, listening to nothing. No footsteps. No requests. No tension. Just space. It was the first time I'd had the apartment to myself, knowing I'd never have to pretend again. The knowing settled into my bones with a strange sense of peace. I moved methodically. Everything that mattered to me had already been taken to the trailer in quiet, calculated trips. Today, there were only the final details to tend to, emptying out the last drawer of my nightstand, collecting my yoga mat from the closet, grabbing my spare charger from behind the couch. I didn't feel rushed. I felt clean. Certain. This wasn't an escape. It was a release. The sun streamed through the windows, golden and too warm for late autumn. I walked barefoot through the apartment one last time, taking in the shell of what we used to call a home. Our couch, still slightly sunken on the side Calder always chose. The framed abstract print we both pretended to like because it was modern. The empty fruit bowl on the kitchen island. I brushed my fingertips along the marble counter we'd once excitedly picked out together, recalling how we stood in the showroom debating edges and patterns like it was the most important decision in the world. None of it mattered now. I placed the letter in the center of the kitchen table, exactly where his laptop usually sat. The paper was folded neatly, the ink dry, the truth simple. It wasn't a list of grievances. It wasn't a blow-by-blow of betrayal. It was a clean statement, handwritten in my calmest script. Calder. There's no fight. No drama. No demands. Just the truth. I'm done. I've seen what you didn't think I would. I know who you are when I'm not looking. There's nothing left to salvage. Not for me. I've already gone. Please don't contact me. Marin. I laid my wedding ring beside it, rose gold, thin, modest, the one I'd chosen because I didn't want a showy diamond. I remember the day Calder slid it onto my finger, his eyes warm, voice steady. "You'll always be safe with me," he'd said. He was wrong. I slipped my jacket over my shoulders and picked up my bag, lighter than I expected. One last look around. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't heartbroken, but because I'd already cried all the tears this place deserved. Crying again would only rebind me to what I was trying to shed. And I needed to let it go. Completely. On the way out, I paused in the doorway and turned back, just once. A final glance. The apartment looked untouched. No chaos. No broken picture frames or suitcase trails. Just stillness. If a stranger walked in, they might think the woman who lived there had simply gone for a walk. Maybe to the market. Maybe to yoga. But she wasn't coming back. The elevator ride down was slow. Too slow. I watched the numbers tick backward, 21, 20, 19, like a countdown to freedom. My heart beat louder the lower I went, not with fear, but with finality. When the doors opened, I stepped into the lobby and didn't look back. The doorman nodded at me. "Have a good one, Mrs. Reese," he said with the same practiced friendliness he'd used for years. "Thanks," I replied softly. "Take care." Outside, the city was alive, unaware that my entire world was shifting beneath my feet. I walked the few blocks to where I'd parked my car now, not ours, and slid into the driver's seat. The air inside smelled like peppermint and upholstery, nothing like the false warmth of our apartment. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, heart steady. When I turned the ignition, the engine purred to life like it had been waiting for me. I pulled out of the garage and onto the road that would take me back to Orton Hills. To my little trailer. To the trees. To Raina and Camille. To something I hadn't had in years, solitude without sorrow. The city thinned as I drove. Towering glass buildings gave way to winding streets and distant hills. I rolled down the window as the air cooled, letting the wind tangle in my hair and press against my skin like a baptism. I didn't feel scared. I didn't feel lost. I felt light. The trailer was just as I left it, still, serene, waiting. I parked beside it and stepped out, my boots crunching softly on gravel. The pines swayed in the breeze, their tops brushing against the sky like they were whispering to each other. The door creaked open as I stepped inside, and I was wrapped immediately in the familiar warmth of cedar and quiet. My books. My blankets. My space. I sank onto the bed and let my bag fall to the floor. I lay back, arms stretched, and stared at the ceiling, watching a tiny crack trace its way along one of the panels. I hadn't noticed it before. It wasn't perfect. None of this was. But it was mine. Outside, birds called to each other in the fading afternoon light. Somewhere down the hill, I heard Raina's old truck engine rumble as it pulled into her barn. Life continued in its simple rhythm. No texts. No lies. No performance. Just breath. Just presence. And for the first time in months, maybe years, I didn't feel like I was running away. I felt like I was arriving. The noise began as soon as he found the letter. At first, it was just a vibration against the wooden nightstand, my old phone skittering across the surface like it had a mind of its own. I'd powered it back on that morning out of obligation, not curiosity. There was a part of me that needed to hear the lie in his voice one more time, to confirm that silence was the right answer. The moment it connected to service, it exploded. It exploded with a backlog of Calder's messages, texts, voicemails, missed calls, emails, each one a different tone, a different version of him. The chameleon of remorse, anger, panic, and denial. I sat on the edge of the bed in the trailer, the morning sunlight filtering through the blinds in golden stripes, and just stared at the screen as if it might burn through my palm. 47 messages. 17 missed calls. 6 voicemails. My stomach didn't twist, my throat didn't close. I just felt tired. So tired of the noise he carried with him like a storm cloud. Tired of being the steady one in the hurricane. Tired of knowing he'd only care now that I was gone. I played the first voicemail. Marin. Jesus, Marin. What the hell? What is this? You can't just leave. Where are you? Call me. The second. I don't understand. You're overreacting. Is this about work? We can talk about it. Let's not blow this out of proportion. The third was quieter, slower, like he'd rehearsed it. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to yell. I didn't know you were so unhappy. Can we please talk? Come home. Let's fix this. I stopped listening after that. The rest would be variations on a theme, apologies that weren't apologies, attempts to rewrite the narrative, pleas disguised as concern. I didn't need to hear him spiral. I already knew the rhythm of his unraveling. I'd danced to it enough times in my head, rehearsed my responses in imaginary arguments that always ended with me crying and him standing there, unmoved. But this time I had left first. And that was a power he couldn't comprehend. I scrolled through his texts out of sheer curiosity, wondering how long it would take for the shift. It didn't disappoint. Calder, what is this? Come home and talk like adults. Calder, this isn't you. Someone's put you up to this. Calder, if you think you're going to just disappear, you're delusional. Calder, I'm sorry. Please, just call me. Calder, I talked to a lawyer. You'll be hearing from them. Calder, I didn't do anything to deserve this. You're being cruel. Calder, please. I can't sleep. I can't breathe. I held the phone in both hands, letting the weight of his desperation press into my palms. Not once did he say he understood. Not once did he ask what I needed. It was all about him. His confusion, his discomfort, his loss of control. His unraveling wasn't grief, it was fury disguised as heartbreak. Calder loved best when he had the upper hand. I had taken that from him. He didn't want me back. He wanted his power back. I powered the phone off again, tossing it into the drawer with a thud that sounded too satisfying. Then I stood, stretched, and opened the windows wide. The morning air was crisp and wild with pine, the kind of scent that reminded you the world was still big and full and alive. I made tea, wrapped myself in a knit cardigan Raina had left on my steps, and stepped onto the porch. I wasn't sure how long I stood there, staring out at the trees. Maybe 15 minutes. Maybe an hour. But when I finally turned my head, Raina was there, leaning against the post at the end of the stairs like she'd been waiting. "You find the note?" she asked casually. I nodded. "Stormy. Like a damn monsoon," I said, and she laughed, short and sharp. "He'll get worse before he gets quiet," she said. "Just keep your doors locked and your peace louder than his chaos." I liked that. Peace louder than his chaos. I held on to those words as I sipped my tea and listened to the wind comb through the forest. Later that day, I walked into town, needing movement, grounding. I stopped by the Hollow Glass, where Camille handed me a latte without asking and slid a shortbread cookie beside it like a silent gift. She could read my face better than most. "You doing okay?" she asked, wiping down the counter. "I think so," I said, sitting on the stool. "He's unraveling. Saying all the things he should have said a year ago. But none of it matters now." She tilted her head. "You believe that?" I thought about it. About the way my chest had stayed steady this morning, the way my breath hadn't caught once as I listened to his voicemails. "Yeah," I said finally. "I do." She nodded, satisfied. That's how you know you've left for the right reasons. When their words can't pull you back. For the rest of the afternoon, I wandered, through little shops, down the winding roads, past porches filled with rocking chairs and wind chimes. No one knew me here. And yet I didn't feel unknown. People waved, smiled. A woman at the bookstore offered to order a novel I'd mentioned. An old man at the hardware store helped me find batteries for my flashlight. Small gestures. Real ones. When I returned to the trailer, I found another message had been slipped into my inbox, a notice from a lawyer Calder had hired. He was filing for divorce. No fanfare. No threats of property or fights over what little we had. Just a tidy, transactional request for dissolution. I stared at the screen for a long moment before clicking download. Then I printed the paperwork, signed it without hesitation, and scanned it back to the firm. It was over. No courtroom drama. No screaming matches or long, drawn-out explanations. Just a clean break. A simple release. I never replied to any of Calder's texts. Never returned his calls. The last thing I ever said to him was written in ink on a single sheet of paper next to a ring I no longer wore. And that silence, my silence, was the loudest truth I had ever spoken. That night, I stood beneath the stars, the trailer warm behind me, the trees rustling like applause. I looked up into the vastness of the sky, 1,000 glittering points staring back at me, and whispered the 3 words I never sent him, the ones that had stayed locked in my throat for too long. I know everything. The trails welcomed me like an old friend I hadn't known I missed. They twisted through the woods behind Raina's land, narrow footpaths laced with fallen pine needles, tree roots, and small stones that demanded presence with every step. My feet struck the ground in a steady rhythm, my breath sinking with the rustle of the trees and the occasional bird call overhead. I wasn't running for speed. I wasn't running from anything either. I was running for me, for the weight that needed burning off my chest, for the quiet my body craved more than sleep. I'd started with short walks in the mornings, pacing the edge of the property, staring up at the shifting sky. Then it turned into jogs. Then longer runs, deeper into the woods where I couldn't hear anything but the wind and the sound of my own heartbeat. That was how it began, this new habit of finding peace in motion. Some mornings, the trails were slick with dew, the scent of damp earth wrapping around me like a grounding tether. Other days, they were golden with sunlight, streaks of brightness breaking through the pines, lighting the way like gentle invitations. I didn't listen to music. No podcasts, no playlists, no distractions. Just nature and breath. I liked the quiet. I liked hearing myself again. Afterward, I'd come back to the trailer, cheeks flushed, clothes damp with sweat, and Camille would be waiting with coffee at the hollow glass like she had some sixth sense for my schedule. We didn't always talk. Sometimes I'd just sit at the counter, nursing a steaming mug, watching her fold napkins or prep for the lunch crowd. She never pried. She never asked how I was unless she truly wanted the answer. And when I did speak, she always listened like it was the only thing in the world worth hearing. One afternoon, after a particularly long run that left my legs pleasantly sore, I returned to find Raina fixing a fence near the edge of the property. She waved me over, hammer still in hand, her curly hair tied back in a bandana. "You run like someone who used to hold a lot in," she said with a grin. "You're lighter these days." "I feel lighter," I admitted, wiping my forehead with the hem of my shirt. Physically, mentally, all of it. She leaned against the post, nodding. Funny what happens when you finally stop carrying someone else's weight. It was true. For years, I'd carried Calder's moods, his silences, his half-truths. I'd tiptoed around his defensiveness, filled in the emotional gaps he left behind, tried to hold up a crumbling foundation with my bare hands. Now, with every step I took into the woods, it felt like I was releasing another piece of him, like he was falling off me in shards I didn't need anymore. Later that week, on my way into town, I spotted a man on the side of the road, crouched beside a rust-colored truck with one flat tire and a scattered pile of tools. I slowed instinctively, the way you do when you've lived in a small town long enough to understand that help isn't an offer, it's a reflex. He looked up as I pulled over, his dark hair a bit tousled, a faint smear of grease across his cheek. "Flat decided to give up on me halfway through breakfast," he said, straightening with a crooked smile. "I'm Julian." "Marin," I replied, stepping out. "Need a hand?" He lifted an eyebrow, amused. "You know how to fix a flat?" "I know how to follow directions and hold things steady. That count." He laughed, and we got to work. It wasn't anything dramatic, no meet-cute music playing in the background, no slow-motion glances, but it was warm. Easy. We talked while he jacked the truck up and I handed him tools. He was a painter, recently moved back to Harper Glen after a few years out west. Said he missed the slow pace, the way people waved from their porches, the smell of honeysuckle in spring. "You live out near the ridge?" he asked when I mentioned Raina. I nodded. "In the trailer behind her land. Peaceful spot. It's becoming home." He smiled again, softer this time. "Good. Everyone deserves a place that feels like theirs." That sentence stayed with me. Everyone deserves a place that feels like theirs. For the first time in years, I did. Not because of its size or style or amenities, but because every choice in that trailer was mine. Every mug, every book, every quiet morning, it belonged to me. It didn't come with strings or subtext or compromise. Just comfort. Over the next few weeks, I kept running. Kept breathing. Camille and I started playing cards some nights after closing, a quiet ritual of coffee refills, laughter, and the kind of conversations that felt like lifelines. Raina would swing by with fresh eggs or a new pair of gloves, muttering about how the cold creeps into the bones faster this high up. And Julian? Julian started showing up more often. Sometimes I'd find a sketch taped to my mailbox, a charcoal drawing of the trees behind the trailer, or a fox he'd seen on the trail. No pressure. No suggestion. Just presence. One evening, he invited me to see his studio, a converted barn on the edge of town. The walls were covered in canvases, some abstract swirls of color, others delicate renderings of wildlife and local landmarks. He handed me a brush. "You paint?" "Not since college," I said, holding it like it might break. "Well, you do tonight." We didn't talk much as we painted. Just stood side by side, dipping into colors, letting instinct lead. My strokes were uncertain, but free. I didn't care about the result. That wasn't the point. I cared that my hands were making something. That no one was watching or judging or rewriting my story as I went. When I finally stepped back, my canvas was a mess of gold and forest green, streaked with light and shadow. I didn't know what it was supposed to be. I just knew it was mine. Julian looked at it and nodded. "Looks like freedom." I laughed. "I think it is." That night, I drove back to the trailer under a sky stitched with stars. The air smelled like pine and possibility. I climbed into bed, wrapped in a fleece blanket, and listened to the trees move outside my window. My life was quieter now. Slower, but every part of it felt like it belonged to me. My body, my breath, my joy, they were no longer borrowed or suppressed. They were mine. And in that quiet, I found something I hadn't known I'd lost. Myself. The bell over the door chimed like it always did, soft and familiar. I was behind the counter at the amber mug, wiping down tables between the slow morning wave and the early lunch crowd, humming to myself while the espresso machine hissed in the background. The smell of cinnamon rolls and dark roast clung to the air, grounding me in this rhythm I'd come to love. Small-town mornings weren't dramatic. They didn't rush. They didn't ask for more than your presence. And then, a voice said my name. "Marin." I froze, my rag still in one hand, body tensing before my brain caught up. It was the voice I'd learned to live without. The one that used to call me at midnight to say he missed me. The one that had lied through its teeth with the smoothness of silk. I turned slowly, not because I wasn't sure who it was, but because I already knew. Calder stood just inside the door, hands in the pockets of a slate-gray coat I didn't recognize. His face looked thinner, his eyes darker, like sleep had become a stranger. His once carefully trimmed hair had grown longer at the edges, curling slightly above his collar. The confident posture I knew so well, the squared shoulders, the slight forward lean, was gone. He looked broken, like a man trying to hide the wreckage of himself in a tidy shell. He took a step forward. "I've been driving around for days. Someone in town said they thought they'd seen you here." I didn't move. I didn't speak. The rag in my hand dripped quietly onto the floor. Calder glanced around, as if unsure if I'd scream, or cry, or bolt. I needed to see you." I looked at him fully now, letting the silence stretch between us like a taut string. The shop around us continued like it didn't notice the past walking through its front door. A man in the corner read a newspaper. Two women near the window chatted over scones. Outside, the wind rattled the chimes. I took a slow breath. "You shouldn't be here." "I know," he said quickly, nodding, desperate. "I know. But I didn't know how else to reach you. You blocked me everywhere. You left. And then nothing. Just a note and silence." "You don't get to be shocked by silence," I said, voice low, steady. "You created it long before I walked away." He flinched, but he didn't deny it. He moved toward a table, looking at me for permission. I didn't give it, but I didn't stop him either. He sat down like he'd just crossed a desert and needed a place to collapse. I walked around the counter slowly, every step measured. I stayed standing. I wasn't ready to sit across from him. Not yet. He stared up at me, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. She left, he said suddenly. The woman. It didn't last. She moved to Chicago for some new job. Didn't even say goodbye. I didn't react. My reputation tanked after the divorce, he continued. People at work talk behind my back. My numbers are down. I lost the promotion I was in line for. He laughed bitterly. You probably don't care about any of that. I don't, I said simply. He nodded, rubbing his jaw like it ached. I thought I had time. I thought we could fix it. We can't. I know, he said quickly, his voice breaking slightly. I know that now. Marin, I haven't stopped loving you. I blinked slowly. Not because I was surprised. He always knew when to pull that line out, but because of how hollow it sounded now. Like a key that used to fit, but no longer turned the lock. You say that like love excuses everything, I said, folding my arms. But love without respect, without truth, without presence, it's just control. It's just comfort for you and prison for me. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. I know I messed up. I know I lied. I was stupid and selfish, and I thought you'd never leave me. That was your first mistake. His gaze dropped to the floor. I miss us. There is no us anymore, I said softly, not out of cruelty, but because he needed to hear the truth without decoration. He looked up, pain clouding his face. I think about you every day. I dream about you. I imagine what our life could have looked like if I hadn't. But you did, I cut in gently. You did exactly what you chose. Over and over. And I was the one who paid for it until I stopped. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the wood grain of the table like it might offer him an answer. I got an offer, he said eventually. A job. In Silver Cross. It's a chance to start fresh. I thought maybe, if you came with me, we could. No. He looked up. No, I repeated. You still don't get it. I don't need a fresh start with you. I already started over without you. I don't need fixing. I needed freedom. He opened his mouth to protest, but the words didn't come. Instead, his shoulders sagged, and he looked older than I'd ever seen him. I never really saw you, did I? He said quietly. I thought I did. But I didn't. No, I said. You saw who I was when I needed you. But when I needed something back, you disappeared. He stood slowly, awkwardly, like the weight of our conversation had pressed him down a few inches. I guess I needed to hear this, he murmured. Even if it hurts. I nodded. I needed to say it. He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and placed something on the table. A photo. Us. From years ago. Before the wedding. I was laughing, my hand over my eyes, his face turned toward me like I was his whole world. I kept this in my wallet, he said. Even after you left. I stared at the image for a moment, then gently pushed it back toward him. Keep it. Maybe it'll remind you not to ruin the next woman who trusts you. He didn't argue. He picked it up slowly, tucked it away, and turned toward the door. I really did love you, he said, not looking back. I believe you, I said. But that's not enough. He left without another word. The bell over the door chimed again, and just like that, he was gone. I stood there for a long time, heart calm, hands steady. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't reliving. I wasn't retreating into doubt. I was free. He found me again the next day. This time, he didn't walk into the coffee shop. He waited outside, leaning against the passenger side of my car, hands shoved in his coat pockets, that same frayed edge in his posture like the wind might knock him over. I spotted him as soon as I stepped out of the cafe, the to-go bag of cinnamon rolls and a thermos of hot tea balanced in my arms. The March air was crisp but bright, and the sunlight felt like a shield between us. I didn't quicken my steps. I didn't freeze either. I walked like I belonged to this moment, because I did. Marin, he said, straightening up. Can we talk? One more time. I didn't answer. I clicked the lock on the car, opened the back seat door, placed the bag and thermos inside, then slowly turned to face him. "Please," he added, voice softer now, cautious. I looked at him fully. "We already talked, Calder." His mouth opened, then closed. "I know. There's more I want to say. I've been thinking about us. About everything." I waited, arms crossed. I was done giving him cues. If he wanted to talk, he'd have to carry the weight. "I meant what I said yesterday," he continued. "About Silvercross. It's quiet, it's clean, and it's a good opportunity for me. For us. You don't have to go back to what we had before. I know that's gone. But maybe we can start something new. Maybe not as the people we were, but who we are now. We've both changed." The sincerity in his voice might have wrecked me a year ago. Back when I was still willing to shape myself around his apologies, still bending to the hope that someday he'd finally see me. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I let the silence sit, long enough to watch the flicker of hope in his eyes begin to fade. "I believe you mean that," I said, finally. "I believe you want another chance. But this isn't about what you want anymore." His eyebrows knit together. "What does that mean?" "It means I don't want to go anywhere with you. I don't want Silvercross. I don't want a new beginning with the same person who shattered the last one. I don't want to try and rebuild what you broke." His face tightened. "You're just going to throw everything away?" I took a step forward, my voice calm but sharp. "I didn't throw anything away. I fought for us. For years. I begged you with my silence. With every quiet dinner, every unanswered question, every moment I swallowed my hurt just to keep the peace. You threw it away. Piece by piece." He looked away, jaw clenched, eyes blinking against the sun. "I didn't realize how far gone we were." "You didn't look," I said. "You didn't want to see it. And now that you've finally lost something, now it matters." "People make mistakes, Marin. You made yours too." "I did," I said without hesitation. "I stayed too long." His mouth opened in protest, but I raised a hand. "I'm not here to hurt you. I don't want revenge. I want peace. And I have it now. I built it. With my own hands. In a trailer behind a pine grove with people who don't lie to me. I wake up and breathe. I laugh. I run. I paint. I help fix tires on the side of the road without wondering who I'm letting down. My life is mine now." He flinched slightly, and I didn't look away. "You don't get to walk in with sad eyes and apologies and expect me to hand it back to you." "I never stopped loving you," he whispered. "I stopped loving you," I replied. The words were heavier than I expected. Not cruel, just final. And true. I'd clung to the memory of us like a lifeline for so long. But memory isn't love. Nostalgia isn't enough. The woman I was when I married him loved him deeply. But that woman had learned too much. He nodded, swallowing hard, and stepped away from the car. "So that's it?" "That's it." He paused, then gestured vaguely at the horizon. "What are you going to do now?" "I'm going to drive home," I said, smiling faintly. "And reheat my tea. Probably eat both cinnamon rolls. Then maybe go for a run before the sun goes down." "Alone?" I laughed. "Not lonely." He looked at me like he was trying to memorize the version of me that had finally slipped out of his reach. But I was already gone, even as I stood there. "I hope you find something good," I said gently. "Something real." He nodded, eyes glossy, and turned to walk away. I watched him disappear down the street, his figure shrinking with each step, swallowed by the trees and storefronts. The moment he vanished, I exhaled. Not from relief. From return. The drive back to the trailer felt lighter than ever. I rolled down the windows and let the wind kiss my skin, let the sun find my face. The hills opened up around me like arms, familiar and waiting. By the time I reached the gravel drive, I felt like myself again. Not Marin the wife. Not Marin the runner. Just Marin. I carried the cinnamon rolls inside, poured my tea into a ceramic mug, and sat on the porch steps, letting the warmth seep into my hands. Raina's chickens clucked in the distance. The trees whispered overhead. Somewhere, a woodpecker tapped out its steady rhythm. This was my life. No longer shaped around someone else's needs. No longer defined by how well I could hold together something cracked and hollow. It was mine. Julian texted me a sketch of the hillside trail we'd talked about painting. I smiled and texted back, "Let's do it tomorrow." I didn't know what the future held. I didn't need to. What I had was enough. Peace, breath, a home tucked under trees, people who saw me without needing me broken. And for the first time, truly, I wasn't living in reaction to someone else's choices. I was living my life, not his.